Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. Short programming note about this episode, which is about the new English edition of the Moreh Nevuchim. There will be a follow-up episode later this week discussing this new English edition. That will be a sort of review comment on this edition. That will be with Rabbi Shneur Burton. This episode is with the editor of this new and translator of this new edition, Professor Lenn Goodman. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Zaidi Auctions. Check out their new catalog for their upcoming third auction, Sunday, December 22nd at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, with many beautiful items. And you can check out the link to bid in the show's notes below. This episode is also sponsored by Avichai Muller, L'zecher Nishmas Mr. Shalom Jacob. Shalom was a Yerei Shemayim, a Talmid Chacham, and an Ish Sefer who was responsible for bringing light to many orphan Sfarim and manuscripts, 28 in total. Shalom was a highly regarded attorney and was held in high esteem by Rabbanim and Talmidei Chachamim, a true Ish Ashkeles whose two best friends were Torah and Emes. After his passing, his family established the Shalom Jacob Memorial Institute to continue the great work that Shalom dedicated his life to. The institute is currently working on several projects which Shalom was focused on at the time of his Petira. Shalom had a particular appreciation for the manuscripts of Tzvi Grudzinski, a towering Talmid Chacham, and was responsible for bringing several of his manuscripts to life. The institute is currently working to publish a second volume of Mayadei Tzvi on Mayadim, Shal Shetuvas Tzferes Tzvi and Yeridea, among other Kisvei of Tzvi Hirsch. And I'll mention that the new volume of Tzvi Hirsch's Halachas and Halachas Nida came out, was published recently. So this episode is, again, L'zecher Nishmas Shalom Jacob, Alav Shalom. As a personal note, I wasn't contacting him about perhaps doing an episode. It unfortunately never came to be. And again, he's republished many Sfarim, and so for anyone interested, there's also a website now. I'll try to link to the website now of the family, what they've done since. To sponsor an episode of the podcast or to support the show, you can check out the links in the show's notes below, or you can email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com. You can also subscribe to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new Svarim, new books, book deals, and the like. The link is in the show's notes below. And also, if you can subscribe to the podcast and you can rate and review the podcast, I appreciate it. And with that, enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Lenn E. Goodman, who is Professor of Philosophy and Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Vanderbilt University. And we'll be discussing his brand new, complete in one volume, new English translation of Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim, The Guide to the Perplexed, a new translation. He actually did this together with Philip Lieberman. And this translation is published by Stanford University Press. I'll say right at the outset, the list price is $50. It often goes less on Amazon, which is for one volume and a hardcover is excellent. And also, he also published together with that a companion volume titled A Guide to the Perplexed, a reader's companion to Maimonides' masterwork. Also by Stanford University Press. This is about $25. This is a paperback. That's a separate volume. And we're going to be discussing Rambam and Moreh Nevuchim, The Guide to the Perplexed, and things like that. And just for the listener, it's actually interesting that I did when the Yeshiva University Museum had the exhibit on Rambam. I did a podcast episode on that, but otherwise really have not done a lot on Rambam. So finally get to discuss Rambam and one of his major works. So thank you, Professor Goodman, for joining me.
It's quite a pleasure to be here. I can tell you I saw a comparable exhibition back at Oxford where I did my DPhil. They had a wonderful display of rare manuscripts of the Rambam. The Rambam was very popular in late medieval Spain, right up until the time that the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492. And so there are beautiful illuminated editions of the Mishneh Torah, the Achazakah, as we call it, and also of the Moreh Nevuchim. And I was able to have some of that artwork used on the cover of the guide and of the Guide to the Guide, the Guide to the Guide Perplexed, as we might say, that's possible. It was a wonderful exhibit of rare manuscripts, and I'm so glad you got to see it as I did in Oxford. Tell me what I can tell all our listeners.
Okay, so let's start off. Tell the listeners about yourself and your background.
Okay, I was born in Detroit. Moved as a small child to Los Angeles, grew up in Los Angeles, got some Jewish education there as well as general education, and then I went off to Harvard. And at Harvard, I majored in philosophy and Near Eastern languages. My main Near Eastern language at that time was Arabic. I knew some Hebrew growing up, but I studied Arabic seriously first on the high school program at UCLA as a special student there, and then at Harvard. And I had an ambition to work on the relationship between Jewish and Islamic philosophy. There were two reasons for that. One is that I wanted to try and devote myself to promoting understanding between Jews and Muslims. That's beginning to bear some fruit now in much later years. And the other was because I knew that there had been a period where philosophy and religion came together in the Middle Ages. My father, as a student at Harvard on the GI Bill just after World War II, had taken a course from Harry Wolfson, the great scholar of Jewish and monotheistic philosophy. And he knew what an important figure Maimonides was, and he knew how much Jewish thinking had profited from the interchange of ideas between Muslims and Jews in the Middle Ages, starting in the 9th, 10th century and going on into the Rambam's years. Rambam was born in 1238. I mention that because sometimes people will see, even today, the mistaken date of, I say, he was born in 1138. But sometimes they make a mistake and follow a somewhat fanciful date, 1135. No, he was born in 1138, and when he was only 10 years old, he and his family were exiled from Cordoba, where he was born, and Cordoba and the whole southern region of Spain had been conquered by a very militant Muslim group, the Almohads, who claimed to be the only monotheists. And if you didn't agree with them, whether you were a Jew or a Christian or even a Muslim of a different persuasion, you were subject to death or conversion. And Maimonides may have lived in as a crypto Jew. His family seems to have pretended to be Muslims for a while. They lived in North Africa. Eventually, they had to get out of there. They went to the land of Israel, but only were able to stay there for about a year because that land at that time was under the sway of the Crusaders, not very comfortable or happy or safe for Jews to live there. They made it to Egypt. And in Egypt, Maimonides he had learned to practice medicine, and he became a physician at the court of a man who founded a new dynasty in Egypt. His name in the West is known as Saladin, Salahuddin in Arabic. He was a Kurdish Sunni Muslim. He overthrew the Shiites who had been ruling in Egypt. And Maimonides was the physician of his right-hand man, who was known as the virtuous Qadi, the virtuous judge, who was a great talent scout. He picked Saladin to be the new ruler, and he picked Maimonides to be his own physician. Rambam became a doctor. I should explain, by the way, that the Rambam did not believe in taking money for being a rabbi. When he reached Egypt, soon after reaching Egypt, he became quite famous for his commentary on the Mishnah. He wrote that commentary in Arabic, and it's the commentary in which his famous 8 chapters that many readers have read on its own, a work on Jewish virtue ethics. That's part of his commentary on the Mishnah. It's his introduction to Pirkei Avot. That is that commentary on the Mishnah made the Rambam famous, and he became a leader of the Jewish community. Early on in his time in Egypt, he was writing letters which survive in the Cairo Geniza about the need to contribute money to rescue Jewish captives, a problem we still have now. very, very alive today with the hostage situation that's going on in Gaza. But he was a leader of the Jewish community. He was a physician at the court. He thought it was wrong to take money for being a rabbi, but he was consulted all over the Jewish world for guidance, for advice about rabbinical decisions. He became quite the authority on halakha, and after the commentary on the Mishnah, he wrote a compilation, a catalog raisonné, as I call it, of the 613 Taryag mitzvot, of the mitzvot of the Torah, and that became the backbone of his superb juridical work, the Yad Chazakah, the 14 volumes of his codification of halakha, which is still authoritative, still deeply studied by traditional Jews to this day. And that one he wrote in Mishnaic Hebrew. It had universal relevance to Jews wherever they might live. But for Jews who knew Arabic, there was a special set of problems which Jews who did not know Arabic at that time had not yet confronted. They were philosophical problems that came out of the philosophy tradition of the Greeks. Many works of Greek philosophy, science, medicine had been translated, astronomy too, had been translated into Arabic. And Maimonides was a master of that literature, as well as the philosophical and theological literature that the Arabs themselves had built upon that Greek foundation. And so he was able to address problems that Jews who had been exposed to what was then modern philosophy were confronting. How was creation possible? How was revelation possible? What can we say about the suffering of innocence and the apparent prosperity of the welcome of the wicked? He was able to address those questions, and just as he had straightened out and organized the massive body of halakha in the Yad Chazakah, the Mishneh Torah, as he called it, so he was able to address rather systematically the philosophical problems and the cosmological problems and the religious problems that Jews who had been exposed to Greek and Arabic philosophy and science were confronting in his time. That work he wrote in Arabic, and that's the work that I have translated along with my friend Rabbi Phil Lieberman. We worked on this for a number of years. I had been working on these texts since 1970, and we have now brought out that work of many decades. And I can tell those who read it, and you'll see this in the commentary that Phil and I wrote, that we learned on every page of the Guide to the Perplexed, the Moreh Nevuchim, and we continue to learn from that work. I will tell you that every day I learn something new from the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim. Every day I look at it.
We'll return to the episode in a moment, but this episode is sponsored by Azadi Auctions. Check out their new catalog for their upcoming third auction, Sunday, December 22nd at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, with many beautiful items, including Lot 4, a beautiful 4-volume first edition set of the Pnei Yeshua, Lot 16, a first edition Sha'al Teshuvas Chacham Tzvi with the signature of Rav Shlomo of Chelm, the Merkavas and Mishnah, Lot 22, which is fascinating, and Sha'al Teshuvas Noda B'Yehuda Madura Tinyana with a handwritten dedication of Rav Shmuel Landau. Shmuel Landau, the Noda B'Yehuda's son, was actually the editor and the publisher of the Noda B'Yehuda. Lot 40, a Maleches Machsheves of Rav Moshe Chayfetz with the famous picture with the long hair and no yarmulke. More to talk about with that for a different time. I'm sure I've discussed in the podcast in the past. Lot 66 is a manuscript of the Chassam Sofer, and then subsequent lots there's the Chassam Sofer's family, Talmidim, different manuscripts and letters. Lot 119 is Ema Banim Smecha, first edition printed in 1944 in Hungary. There's many more classics, letters, and so on. So again, Azadi Auctions, check out the link and information in the show's notes below. And now back to the episode. Okay, so thank you for the introduction to the Rambam. There's obviously a lot to get into. Before we dive into Myra, just to mention some other biographical things. First of all, the Rambam also wrote medical works
He did.
as well.
Wrote 10 medical works, some of them in multiple volumes. And those are all in Arabic, of course.
Maybe, perhaps, he wrote a commentary on Gemara and Talmud. We have something on Rosh Hashanah that was published once from manuscripts. Maybe.
He did write some on that. He doesn't seem to have published his Talmudic writings apart from the Mishneh Torah. And I skipped some of my own background. I'll go back to that later. But he was he wrote on the calendar. He wrote on logic. I mentioned the work that he wrote on ethics, which is the 8 chapters, a very accessible book. Those of your listeners who like to teach will find the 8 chapters is a wonderful book to teach, not only because it's an introduction to Pirkei Avot, but because it's a systematic treatment, a very logical treatment of Jewish virtue ethics. What does it mean to be a good person by biblical standards?
Yeah, the Shemona Prakim of the Rambam. Also, the Rambam, because he lived in Egypt, for those that we're not going to go in depth here into the Cairo Geniza, but the Geniza we have things from his handwriting, letters, and different things from the Rambam himself. I do want to mention something about his letters. Also, there's his brother, who he was very close with. His brother perishes at sea, and that affects him greatly, right?
It deeply affected him. The original plan in the family when they got to Egypt was that Rabbi Moshe would be the scholar of the family, and his younger brother David would be the principal breadwinner. He was engaged in trade, and he undertook a journey. One of the things that survives in the Cairo Geniza is a letter he wrote after surviving the most difficult and dangerous seeming part of the journey. The people had been attacked by brigands along the way. Some had died, some had gotten lost, some had died of thirst. But the brother made it to the sea voyage, which he thought would be the easy part of the voyage, and unfortunately, the ship was lost, as those ships often were. I tell a little bit in the introduction to the guide how those ships were put together. It wasn't by chewing gum and baling wire. It was by rope made out of palm fibers, and the sea was very treacherous, and David was lost. And the Rambam spent almost a year nearly prostrate with grief. He felt responsible that his brother had undertaken this journey in behalf of the family. He now was responsible to support that brother's widow and children. He was able to do so by practice of medicine, but it was a big change for him, and you can see in his dealing with the problem of evil. Your listeners will know that when we deal with the problem of evil, there's natural evil like storms and earthquakes, landslides, and there's human evil, the bad things that people do to one another. The Rambam talks about both, and part of the challenge that the loss of his brother meant, he had taught that younger brother. He had loved him dearly, as Nafi said, and now he had lost him, and it wasn't just the loss of support, or the loss of the family wealth, which was invested in the merchandise that David was carrying to India for sale, and hoping to come back with more merchandise that could be sold in Egypt. It was an important kind of mercantile activity for the Jews of Egypt. It was a challenge to him also religiously, because you have to ask yourself, as people always do when they lose a loved one, how could such a terrible thing happen to such a good and honest and generous human being whom one loves so dearly and so closely? And part of what the Rambam had to deal with, and you'll see that reflected in the Guide to the Perplexed, was was the nature of human suffering and why those terrible things can and must happen to us.
Yeah, so that's what there is on the Rambam, at least to start. There's obviously a lot more on the Rambam. There's been many books written on the Rambam, and there's much more to get into. And now we can get a little bit more into Moreh Nevuchim. So you said you left out about yourself, and you kind of did, which is, and I'll focus which part to ask a little bit more, is that you have written a number of books on philosophy, and you've dealt with the Rambam. But now this is a Rambam work. This is a complete translation of Rambam with introductory materials. And by the way, the book is 600 pages. You have extensive notes, a full translation. Why did you decide to focus a book on the Rambam? And obviously, you spent a lot of time working on it just exclusively on Rambam and on Moreh Nevuchim in particular.
Well, the first thing to tell you is you can see that confluence, that coming together of philosophy and religious commitment, of science and belief in God, and trying to work things out. One of the things that philosophers try to do is to explain why things happen and what really matters, and how do you reconcile beliefs that seem to be in conflict with one another. This is a consummate book. It's certainly the most important Jewish book in philosophy, and it deals with most of the major problems that philosophers address, and it deals with them in a very sophisticated way. Rambam is a man who knows medicine and astronomy and logic, but he also knows the Greek philosophers, Aristotle, who had been translated into Arabic, and Aristotle's commentators, men like Themistius, Neoplatonic philosophers like Prof. He knows the ideas of Neoplatonism, which was a philosophical approach founded in the 3rd century by Plotinus, who was also an Egyptian, but a millennium before the Rambam's time. So this is a very important book, and I can tell you, just in terms of my own professional work, I don't believe in devoting oneself to tiny issues. There are people who think that they stay safe by dealing with ever smaller and more specialized issues. It's kind of a fractal pattern. It gets smaller and smaller, and they feel safer and safer. But I think if one is going to be a philosopher, one has to confront the big issues. Big issues deal with questions like the Rambam dealt with in the Guide to the Perplexed, like how does a God who is infinite relate to a world which is finite and determinate? How does a God who is transcendent communicate with human beings and give us a way of life that we can follow that doesn't demand infinite things of us? Some of your listeners might know the Kabbalistic idea, the idea of Tzimtzum, that God has to sort of contract himself, shrink himself down to our scale, and that's an interesting and beautiful metaphor. But what does it mean for an infinite being to assign obligations to finite beings like us? What does it mean for a being which is timeless? And as the rabbis say, it's not that God is in a place, God is the place. That's why they like to call it God Hamakom. Well, how does a God who is so transcendent, a God who is infinite, specify what is right for us, what we should do? God is above time and history, but we live in time and history. How does God give us obligations and commitments and ways of living and styles of being when we're so situated in our own culturally limited and biologically limited environment and context in our historical moment? And the Rambam wants to answer that question. And to come back to the question that you raised, Nahi, I think that's a question that all of us want to answer. We want to know what our role is. We want to know what God expects of us and how it can be that God, who is infinite, has such definite expectations of us as human beings and as members of the people of Israel.
Okay, so let's go to Myra, and I think the place to start, I think for this, we're going to focus a good bit of the episode, obviously discussing your translation and what you did and how you differ from Friedlander and Pinus and all the different Hebrew translations that have come out, because there's a lot of new translations, and there's the classic Ibn Tibbon, etc. So we'll go through the translation and your commentary and what you did. But I think, broadly speaking, we've discussed some of it here or there, but we should discuss what Rambam, just globally speaking, what Myra is, who he wrote it for, who his intended audience is, and what Myra is, some of the broad themes, before we can get into explaining the edition and what you did and your specific edition.
Yes. Let's start out with who he wrote it for, because he gives us a lot of information about that, and he gives it in a very indirect way. Much of the Moed Vahim is written in a very indirect way, and that's one of the reasons for the need for the commentary to spell it out and bring it out in the open. The way he announces who it is that is the intended reader and intended audience of his book is in the letter that he sent, because the whole book was sent in a series of chapters to a former student who had to move away. He was in Aleppo, which isn't that far away, but he was not in Old Cairo, which is called Fustad, which is where the Rambam lived. And so the Rambam wanted to carry on the instruction that he was giving that former student, and in so doing, he pre-qualifies his reader, because he dedicates the book in that letter to this young man who he says, well, you had studied logic with me. You had studied some astronomy. We got about as far as we could, but maybe not quite far enough. I saw that you were good at mathematics. I liked your poetic writing. Maqamat, which is a very demanding genre of poetic prose that was popular in Arabic, very demanding poetic form. Why is he telling us that? Why is he telling us that his intended reader had studied some astronomy and needed to know a little more? Why is he telling him that the man was good in mathematics and logic? Why is he telling us that he admired his poetic sensibilities? All of those are hints about what's expected of the reader of this book. This book is not a book for everybody. Everybody will be able to get a little bit out of it, he says. But the reader who's really going to need this book is going to be able to get a lot out of it. But that's going to be the reader who knows a little astronomy, who knows mathematics and logic, who is prepared for the problems that he's going to confront, who has thought about Islamic dialectical theology, which is called kalam, and is wondering what the worth of that discipline really is and whether it's successful or not. These are areas where the Rambam has experience. These are areas where the student is prepared and has questions to ask. And the poetic sensibility is actually very important, because part of the purpose of the guide is to help readers understand the poetics of the Torah. What do I mean by the poetics of the Torah? We all know that Shir HaShirim is very poetic. We all know that the Tehillim, the Psalms, are very poetic. But what's poetic about Bereshit? Well, Bereshit communicates things to us that cannot be communicated directly. For example, take the opening line. Bereshit bara Hashem et hashamayim v'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. I have to tell my students that's an implied metaphor. When God says Yehi Or, let there be light, there's an implied metaphor there. What's the implied metaphor? What kind of a person can make things happen just by giving orders. That would be a king. And the implied metaphor is telling you that God is like a king. It's telling you that God rules. It's not telling you how, just as it doesn't tell you how God created, which is a very difficult problem. It's not telling you what God looked like or who God's ancestors were, like Babylonian mythology, where there's going to be a pre-creation war out of which the world came. No, it's telling you in a very indirect way, without just trying to bring God down to earth and describe God. It's telling you that God is like a king. You have to have some poetic sensibilities. You have to be able to notice that an implied metaphor can do certain jobs and cannot do other jobs. And he values that in his original reader, and he expects it from all the subsequent readers. He knows that many people will read this book, and he doesn't think, as I said before, he doesn't think it's for everyone. He doesn't think everyone is up to it. They might not have the background in logic or in science. Remember, Rambam is a practicing physician. He knows Aristotle's biology. He knows a lot of astronomy. He's a part of the original contributors to astronomy in his own time, and he's going to rely on that knowledge in dealing with the book and the problems of astronomy and the unsolved problems of astronomy that still existed in his time. He expects the reader to be au courant in that. He's going to give the reader the background and the explanations that are needed, but he has in mind a reader who is ready to grapple with that kind of problem. And he wants to shake off a reader who is not ready, because he thinks a reader like that will be at risk of getting in over his head. He quotes a line, rabbinic line, there are pearls to be gotten on the seabed, but don't go reaching for them if you don't know how to swim. If you haven't trained in swimming, don't go diving for pearls. It's the same with studying philosophical problems. He retells the story about the four sages who went into the Pardes, and Rambam understands the Pardes as being the realm in which one makes inquiry about the deepest and most profound questions about creation and revelation, for example. And of those four great scholars, one became an apostate because he wasn't ready to deal with the issues that he confronted. Rabbinic interpretation is that he wasn't ready to deal with the problem of evil and undeserved suffering. Another went mad. The only one who emerged safe was Rabbi Akiva, and yet Rabbi Akiva was the greatest of them all, the most profound, the most sensitive, the most capable of interpreting the Torah and understanding its relationship to our own lives. That's a remarkable story. He's telling you there's going to be some selection going on here. And the selection is ultimately going to be self-selection. And I will tell you, Nachi, the way the self-selection works, because that's something I had to work out in working on this book. The self-selection works by getting people who are not prepared off the track. They're going to read the first few dozen chapters of this book, The Guide to the Perplexed, and they will not see where it's going, and many of them will not make it to the end. That is intentional on the Rambam's part. In an ordinary book that we read for a college course as an introduction, which defines the terms and lays out the argument and states the problems, you will notice that in the Guide to the Perplexed, the Rambam does not state the problem that he's addressing. He doesn't name the problem of evil, for example, which is a problem of great importance to him. He talks about the book of Job. And of course, the book of Job is a poetic dramatization of the issue about the problem of evil, all right. But long before he talks about that, he's talking about creation. And creation in the time of the Rambam was the most controversial topic around, because philosophers in the tradition of Aristotle and the Neoplatonists thought that creation was impossible. They thought it was proved logically that creation was impossible because you can't get something for nothing. And the Rambam is trying to deal with the question of how does someone who is committed to the Torah reconcile the philosophical claim that creation is impossible with what he thinks he knows about logic and what he thinks about the Torah. He's committed to believing in the Torah and accepting it as a profound truth. And at the same time, he's learned in philosophy that Aristotle thought that the idea of creation was illogical, not just impossible, but irrational. The Rambam's going to defend creation in the Guide to the Perplexed. He doesn't think that it can be proved one way or the other, but he thinks that there are good reasons for upholding the idea of creation, and he's going to spell out what those ideas really are. He's going to evaluate the attempt by the Muslim dialectical theologians, the practitioners of what's called kalam, dialectical theology. He's going to evaluate their attempts to put creation at the center of their theology, and he's going to find that approach wanting. He thinks that they were doing a lot of wishful thinking in their attempt to do theology. And he's going to go back and he's going to say, we Andalusians believe that the argument has to come first. You have to follow where the argument leads. We're not going to say anything that is contrary to the Torah. But if it were proved that creation was impossible, we would have to allegorize it. We'd say it's poetry, it's just a story, and what it really symbolizes is something else. He doesn't think that it is proof that creation was impossible, and he sets about showing you how. But long before he does that, he spends those first few dozen chapters on the anthropomorphisms of the Bible. Anthropomorphisms are places where the Torah speaks about God as though God were a person, a human being with a body, with legs and arms and hands and feet and eyes and ears. It even speaks about God as having bowels, although the Rambam takes that to mean my inward passionate notion, my inward passionate nature. Rambam does a very interesting thing with those anthropomorphisms. And I'll tell you what's interesting, and I'll tell you where he shakes off a lot of modern readers of the Guide. They think that the point of those early first few dozen chapters of the Guide is to refute anthropomorphism. I'll tell you something, and I want all the readers to think about it. If you're a philosopher and you're reading the Guide, you're going to say, to refute anthropomorphism, where's the argument? He assumes that anthropomorphism is wrong. He assumes that it's false. He relies on the authority of Onkelos and Jonathan Ben Uziel, who already de-anthropomorphized much of the Torah, as you know if you read Onkelos. Where's the argument? If the point of those few dozen chapters is to refute anthropomorphism, how does he refute it? He hasn't given an offer of an argument there. He's assumed it's impossible. What's he doing then? Let me tell you what he's doing. And I think that this will help readers who want to be properly prepared to read the Guide to understand the way this thing works. First place, he hasn't stated the problem, you notice. He's left you, if you're worried about the problem, that is, if you're worried about the problem about how God can speak about, how the Torah can speak about God in such anthropomorphic terms, you'll be keyed up about that issue, and you'll be interested in his discussion of the anthropomorphic poetry about God. he takes each of the anthropomorphisms about God and he analyzes it. And when he analyzes it, as you know, analysis means dividing things up in parts, cutting things up. And he analyzes the anthropomorphisms about God in terms of the possible usages that would give different senses to those different terms. The first one he wants to use is Tselem Demut, image and likeness. It says right near the beginning that God created human beings, male and female, in the image and likeness of God. That's interesting. What are we to understand by image and likeness? How can we make sense of that? We know that we're not supposed to try and represent or picture God. We're not supposed to make an image of God. What's the reference there? Sometimes, Rambam explains, analyzing the different usages of the term, and here he's guided by Sadia's technique of finding all the places where the term occurs and seeing the different ways in which it's used and what context requires it to mean. Sometimes those terms have a physical sense. Sometimes they have a non-physical sense. For example, there's a passage in the Tanakh where the prophet is complaining that he's very ill at ease, and he says, he uses that word dama, which is the root for demut, the image. He says he feels like a pelican in the desert. What does that mean? He doesn't mean that he looks like a pelican. A pelican has wings and feathers. The prophet doesn't feel like he has wings and feathers. What he means is that he feels despondent because no one is listening to him. So the reference is to something non-physical. We can understand demut in terms of a likeness which is emotional, spiritual, moral, not necessarily physical. He'll analyze all the terms that he deals with in those early chapters in that sort of way. And what you can get from it, if you look over all those 50, 60 chapters where he does that sort of thing, you'll realize that the analysis produces a hierarchy. Some of these words have a physical sense. Some of them have a social sense. For example, it says you'll go higher and higher, or that they'll go lower and lower. It doesn't mean that they'll climb a mountain. It means that they'll have higher status. Some of them have a social sense. Some of them have a moral sense. Some of them have a spiritual and intellectual sense. Spiritual and intellectual in the Rambam always mean the same thing. And what he gets out of that is that you always have to take the terms that are applied to God in the highest of all those senses, which is going to give you the intellectual, spiritual sense, not the physical sense. So there's a hierarchy, there's a sequence to those different senses of those words, and whenever they're applied to God, they're meant to apply in the most spiritual and intellectual way. Why is that important to teach before you've had any argument for God's being non-physical? Well, when he gets to the point of actually offering the argument that the philosophical reader is going to be looking for, he's going to find that the argument is much broader and much more radical than you might have anticipated. By now, he's pretty much lost the casual reader. The casual reader got bored. He thinks he's seeing refutations of anthropomorphism, and it's gotten kind of repetitive, and he's lost interest in the book. But the serious reader is carrying on and looking for the argument. And the argument, when it comes, is that God transcends all description. Or as he puts it, that God doesn't have any attributes. And he will press that point so far that he says that people who believe that God has attributes are worse than idolaters. Why does he say that? Well, somebody who's an idolater, he says, doesn't really believe that this thing that he's fashioned out of wood or metal created heaven and earth and rules the world. He thinks that it is a way of access to a higher spirit, which is divine. So the idolater doesn't really worship the idol. He just thinks that it's a vehicle of getting to the divine through the idol. But the person who believes that God has attributes is doing something. You know how they say, undergraduates like to say, God created man in his own image, and man returned the compliment. In other words, people invent their own idea of God, and they project their own idea. What would it be like to be powerful? What would it be like to be a king? What would it be like to be a creative individual? They project those ideas onto God, and in so doing, they are inventing a God in their own image. They're not worshiping God at all. They're worshiping that image that they themselves have projected. That's worse than what the idolater does. They're rejecting a figment of their own imagination rather than a transcendent and infinite God, which the Rambam believes is absolute perfection, absolute and infinite perfection, a necessary being, a self-sufficient being. That's the self-sufficient being that we write about on our mezuzah, where it says Shaddai, which the Rambam interprets to mean self-sufficient. Well, do you see what's happening there? If you've been patient and you've analyzed and worked your way through those discussions of anthropomorphism, you realize that he hasn't refuted anthropomorphism yet. But when he does refute anthropomorphism, the refutation is broader and more rigorous and more extreme and radical than you might have expected. That we cannot characterize God, that God is transcendent in the sense that God is beyond our ability to think. And then you have to answer the question, what then can we say about God? What can we think about God? And here you get guidance from the Torah, because the Torah uses all these poetic expressions to point the direction that God is highest, that God is wise, that God is creative, that God is a ruler and judge. You begin to see that transcendence expresses itself in ways that we can relate to and gives us obligations that we can adhere to and try to live up to. That is what the Torah is doing for us. And that's what the poetics of the Torah is opening up to us so we can understand the language of the Torah. You're not, if you will, you're not up the creek without a paddle once you have understood that God is so completely transcendent that it would be hubris, it would be chutzpah of the worst kind to think that we can describe God or define God or bring down God to our own terms. No, we can't do any of those things. But the prophetic inspiration of the Torah gives you imagery which lets you see what perfection would mean in terms that are apprehensible to us. And that brings me back to that first chapter where it says that human beings, male and female, were created in the image and likeness of God. Notice how the Torah stresses male and female. That's a hint, because male and female don't have the same physical appearance. We're a dimorphic species. We have males and females, but they don't look alike. That's telling you indirectly, don't be trying to figure out what God looks like. What is it that male and female have in common? They have in common the rational intellect. And rational intellect is a very abstract sounding notion. The Torah doesn't like to deal in abstractions. So the Torah will tell you male and female are created in God's image and likeness. That is to say, this rational intellect that we have is our connection, is our likeness to God. That's a remarkable idea, and it's going to have a lot of bearing on our practice, our study, and our concept of how we fulfill the mitzvot. But the Torah teaches us that right at the beginning, that we are in the image of God, we bear the image of God, and our task, in a way, is to cultivate that divinity which has its mark within us in what is best in us, which is the use of reason. I'll stop there, but there's lots more to tell. But there's a good idea of how the guide works and why it's organized the way it is.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, the next question was going to be how it's structured, but I think you kind of got there and we answered a lot of that. So, I think the follow-up.
Let me tell you one thing about structure.
Go ahead.
Nobody knew how to structure a book as well as the Rambam did. And you can see that if you read the Mishneh Torah. It's organized the way any good teacher would teach a student to organize an essay or a project or a book. There are the different topics. The Mishnah is not organized that way. It sort of starts out that way and departs from that organization. Talmud is not organized at all. It's very associative. It goes from one topic to the next. It picks up on a phrase. But the Rambam knew how to organize all of halakha, category by category and structure by structure. And if you look at some of those medieval manuscripts, late medieval manuscripts, which were done by calligraphers, look at them sometime and see the beautiful way in which the calligrapher uses color and paragraphing and structure to show you the logical organization of the Mishneh Torah. And you'll see that Rambam knew how to organize a book. In the Guide to the Perplexed, he doesn't use any of that. He writes in an informal, conversational tone. He moves from one topic to another. He repeats himself. He digresses. He anticipates. He defines his terms long after he's used them. He proves his premises long after he's made the assumption. What's he doing? He's writing it in such a way that the casual reader will not get it, will not get into it. He's not interested in trying to make it so that a casual reader can say, oh, I get it, and move on. This is for someone who's committed. This is for someone who's going to read it more than once. And I urge everybody who has gone out and shelled out the $50 or less for the Guide to the Perplexed, I urge you to read it more than once. You'll get more out of it every time, as I do. But that conversational tone is part of what I wanted to convey in the English that we used in translating this. I think he's dictating. He's writing in the 1190s. He's already old. His health is beginning to fail. But he wants to get down in Agadah, which is the vehicle of Jewish theology and philosophical theology. He wants to get down in Agadah something like what he did in Halakha. But in Halakha, it can all be organized in the good Socratic way, cutting the argument at the joints. In the Guide, he's writing for a motivated and prepared reader who has method prerequisites, who knows some logic and some mathematics and some astronomy. And he's going to help you along that road if you've done that prior prerequisite work. And he tells you over and over again that if you haven't done those prerequisites, you're not really ready for this. But that conversational tone has not been present in previous translations.
Yeah, that's something I want to get to. We'll get to the other part that I wanted to ask you here to follow up to a lot of what you've been saying. And of course, by the way, I'll say this already for the listener. Obviously, we could spend hours and hours. I mean, we teach courses on people teach courses on this just on Moreh Nevuchim and going through the chapters and talking about it. Obviously, the shiurim and course things like that. We're not going to do that. You're saying some of the general themes and things like that, and maybe we'll give more examples, especially when I talk about your translation and your commentary. But
sure.
A general question to a lot of what you've been saying is, so what you've been saying is the way Rambam structured it and who his intended audience was. So this goes hand in hand, and we'll focus more when we get to who your intended audience is, but it really comes up here. So is this for the layman to pick up? Is someone listening to this podcast going, well, hold on, I'm not a philosopher. I don't know philosophy well. I'm not bothered by these questions. Or they don't know philosophy. The Rambam is trying to scare me away. Should I be picking this book up, or is this not for me?
Good question. First of all, the Rambam's caution, which was very relevant in his time, is not quite so necessary in our time. We've all been challenged. You don't have to read Arabic translations of Aristotle to be challenged about the question of how does an infinite God relate to a contingent, determinate world? You don't have to read Dawkins or Dennett to know that there's a problem about creation. How are we going to deal with that problem today? We all, even people who haven't been to college, and especially people who have been to college, we all face the problem of evil. It's part of our lives. You know how people say, God helps total strangers. Why doesn't he help me? It's part of our lives. These problems that the Rambam was dealing with are in the forefront of our experience. We have to name them. We have to identify them. We have to point out where he's dealing with them. We have to deal with the question of reward and punishment. We have to deal with the question of what counts as virtue and what counts as vice. These are problems that everyone knows, and the issues that the Rambam deals with and tackles are issues that have been problematized for everyone today. Everyone knows that there are people who think that life is meaningless. Everyone knows that there are people who think that there is no God. Very few people in the Rambam's time would say such a thing. Some might think it, some did think it, but very few people would have said it in those days. Today, it's widely assumed. He wants to address problems which are universal problems. And in that sense, this book is very relevant for everyone. These are problems that we all confront. We need to know, of course, that in his time, creation was regarded as highly problematic, very controversial, something that was thought to have been proved by the best philosophers, and he's going to show you why those arguments by the best philosophers. And he admits that those were the best philosophers, but he says, sometimes they got it wrong. Aristotle talks as if he had proved that creation was impossible, but he knows very well that he never proved such a thing. After all, it was Aristotle who taught us the difference between proof and persuasion. That's the Rambam's line on that one. And when Aristotle uses persuasive language, surely you must believe. You see, he's admitting he didn't have proof. Well, Rambam's going to tell you what creation means. He's going to tell you how creation works. He's going to tell you, if you've never wondered about those things, and there are people today who have never wondered about those things, that's okay. They can take it on faith. But he wants to deal with a thoughtful reader. And I think somebody who picks up this book is going to be a thoughtful reader. He wants to deal with people who want to know, if God is so transcendent, how can God communicate with us? If God is infinite, how can God's moral demands be specified in a particular set of laws and a particular way of life and a particular framework of character that we should address and climb? So this book contains a lot of spiritual guidance. And I think that spiritual guidance is what many of us are looking for today. And those who think they've already got it or don't really need it, we go back to what the Rambam thought. If they think that, because they're hate, they can think what they like. But for many of us, this question of, does God have in mind a way for us to live? That's very relevant to people who read the Torah. That's very relevant to people who don't read the Torah and need to know why there should be such a work as the Torah. And that includes the educated reader. Now, as far as the intended audience of this particular book, it's written in plain English. It's meant to reflect that informal conversational tone that the Rambam himself adopted, which was not present in previous translations. They read somewhat like an office memorandum. But but it's meant for a serious reader. And one of the advantages of the commentary is if the Rambam is explaining something or expecting something or presuming something, or if he's relying on his predecessors, whether they're Jewish philosophers or Muslim philosophers or Greek philosophers that he read in Arabic translation. All that background is given for you. If he's referring to rabbinic ideas, they're all cited in the commentary. Biblical ideas are all cited. So you can go look and see. One of the interesting things that I learned from doing this work is that there's a deep connection between biblical verses in Tanakh, which he quotes very freely and sometimes it seems by memory, and midrashic interpretations. And midrash can be very fanciful, and for that reason, people tend to be dismissive about it. But his use of midrash is very creative, very brilliant. Just as his exploration of halakha is very creative. In both cases, he's using the same assumption that any scientist makes. If a scientist does an experiment and it doesn't work out the way he or she thought it would, the scientist is going to ask, why was that? There's got to be a reason. There's got to be an explanation. Harry Wolfson pointed out that the same is true of studying any of these great texts. If you're reading the Torah and it seems to contradict itself, what's it getting at? What's the difference? What's the nuance? Rambam is very interested in using those problem points for discovering something, and that's something that we all can benefit from. He plays off one midrash against another. Some he just ignores because they're superstitious or fanciful. All of them he takes very seriously because they have something to teach us. And you know how it says in Pirkei Avot, who is wise, he who learns for everyone. That is something that he's ready to do. One of the things I can tell you just as a side issue, he made a serious study of a document that he thought was a reference to pagan thinking, beliefs, and practices. It was called The Nabatean Agriculture. Why did he study a book like that? A book which is full of pagan rituals and magical practices, some of which he thinks are very disgusting. He wants to understand if you're going to really fulfill the whole Torah by abandoning idolatry, you've got to understand what idolatry was, what pagans really believed. And he has that one source, and he becomes an amateur anthropologist long before there was such a thing as an anthropologist. And he says, what can we learn about their practices? How did they think that they were pleasing the gods or displeasing to the gods? Why did they build the temples the way they did? Why did they put those images in them? What did they think was the effect of the gods on the weather and the falling of fruit from the trees and so forth? He can learn from studying that book, and he wishes that he had more books of that nature that would tell him more about that. Because when he gets into the business of explaining the mitzvot, he thinks that many of the mitzvot are designed to be alternatives, radical alternatives to pagan practices. And if we knew more about the pagan practices, we would know more about the mitzvot. Anyway, it's a good example of how open and broad-minded he is.
So you kind of jumped ahead and you answered already some of the questions that I was going to ask, which is, which is okay, totally fine. I just want to say for the listener, which was, obviously they hopefully got this, which was, why is it relevant today? The parts that are relevant, why someone should read it, who the intended audience of your book is. So let's go there. Let's talk about your translation, which is, you said it's written in very simple, plain English. So, you have the book in front of you. Perhaps you want to read even a passage or give an example. What do you mean by that written? This is a work of philosophy. This is a great work. What does it mean it's written in simple English? And when you read it, after you read it, you don't need to compare it to Friedlander or Apinas, but you can talk about for the listener how that differs from previous translations and how you're therefore more readable, and what else you did. That we can get into what else you did differently.
I'll say a word about Friedlander. Friedlander did a very bold thing. He was working in the Victorian period. A lot of people have that book on the shelf. They haven't necessarily gotten into it that much. The Dover people who used to publish it, when I bought my paperback version of the one volume of the guide translated by Friedlander, it was $1.40. They're still selling it for $15, $20, $30. That's because Dover was publishing everything in the public domain. They didn't have to pay an author. They just were publishing stuff where there was no copyright applicable. That was a nice business proposition for them. And I like Friedlander for two reasons. One is that he writes in a Victorian English because he's writing in the Victorian period. And that Victorian English lends itself to talking about theology. That was some of the language that was in use at that time. And people are used to it because of translations of the Bible, which is even more old-fashioned English. So it has a certain assonance to it. The other good thing about Friedlander, which you will not see in the paperback version or the one-volume version, is that Friedlander originally published his translation in three volumes. And in his 3 volumes, he had extensive notes based mainly on the 4 traditional commentaries of the Rambam from medieval times, Ephodi and others like that. And I found those comments often very good guidance, and they're quoted in the notes in the commentary that Phil Lieberman and I put into the book, wherever they're helpful, because there are naughty passages in the guide. There's no question about that. And Friedlander, when Friedlander got stuck with the Arabic, he would turn to the Hebrew Ibn Tibbon, a translation that Rambam himself did not particularly approve of. He was in his last years when that translation was completed, and he wrote a note which we quote in our introductory passages about how you shouldn't try and translate word for word. Translate sentence for sentence. Go for the main meaning, even if you have to use 2 words in place of 1 or 1 word in place of 2. Go for the sense of the fact. Don't try to imitate the syntax of the original. Unfortunately, Ibn Tibbon did all of those errors, and Rambam didn't live long enough to do anything about it. So Ibn Tibbon was it's something that very traditional people who want to read the Rambam and want to go on beyond the Mishneh Torah, they will turn to Ibn Tibbon. But Ibn Tibbon's
Yeah, and I just wanted to jump in just to pause for a second. When you're talking about the different translations already, the Ibn Tibbon, like you say, is the classic. You mentioned the Rambam's letter to him. Recently, Feldheim published just Ibn Tibbon with like some light kind of notes, very little, and it's a new font for those interested in getting that. And then obviously the classic Hebrew one with the commentaries is still around with the Ibn Tibbon. But you
got to remember. Yeah, and that's a nice thing to have.
I just want to point that out, and then also
done something with I think Friedlander on one side, and now that it's in public domain, anybody can do that. But Friedlander has many mistakes in it. He's the reason he so often relies on Ibn Tibbon is his Arabic is not perfect. I don't think anybody's Arabic is perfect, but Arabic is a demanding language. Hebrew is an easy language. Arabic is not so easy. And that's why that's why Friedlander occasionally turns to Ibn Tibbon because it's closer to the time and closer to the spirit of the Rambam, and you can't blame him for that. But that's not a direct translation of the Arabic in every case. Shlomo Pinas did the translation that came out in 1962, and the first thing I've got to tell you is that there's been a huge volume of literature since that time, in 1962. This was work that began in the 50s, and it has it has the impress and to some extent the imprimatur of Leo Strauss. And Leo Strauss ran a very radical thesis about the Rambam. He thought that the Rambam didn't really mean most of what he said in the guide. It's a good question that Herbert Davidson raised. Why would somebody devote so much of his life to Mishneh Torah and Perush Mishnayos, the commentary on the Mishnah, if he didn't really believe these things? But that's a problem for Pinus and his followers to deal with. But Pinus thought that there was a hidden message in the guide which contradicted the overt message. And in the guide to the guide, I have addressed that thesis, and I have, I think, put it to bed. It has been questioned by other good scholars in the past as well, and those people are quoted in the guide to the guide. But I really commend, if you've been confused and befuddled and challenged by Pinus's well-known thesis, widely taught thesis, that Rambam didn't really believe what he was saying, you have to read that section of the guide to the Perplexed. And I think, in Britain they would say I put paid to it. In this country, we could just say I put it to bed. I think that thesis is not tenable. But there's been a huge amount of literature on the guide and different issues and problems in the guide. There have been some very good books written since Pinus's time, one by Joel Kramer, a brilliant biography, one by Moshe Halbertal, one by Herbert Davidson, some big, fat studies of the Rambam and his life and his times and his thinking. And of course, we used that literature, those articles and those books. It's a huge, huge literature. We didn't deal all of it exhaustively. That would have required 6 or 7 big volumes instead of just the one. But we did try to do it justice and to learn from that scholarship. So it was time for another book. There's a convention in translating, which I hope we can get over, that people who translate from the Hebrew or from the Arabic translate in a way that they think is safe, because they want to show that they have understood the syntax and how to parse every sentence, and that they want to show the etymology of every term. They think they're being safe by being literal. And I'm going to tell you, Nachi, literal is not the same as etymological. That's the first thing you have to know. If you think that if you confuse being literal with being etymological, you won't be able to tell the difference between a hospital and a hospice, and you'll take your elderly relative to the wrong place. They might be offended if you do that. The effort to be literal is something that the Rambam rejects in his letter to Ibn Tibon about that translation. He wants you to translate for sense, and that's what we have done. That is going to bring this book to life for people. I don't want it to read like a bureaucratic memo. I want the usage to stand out. I want the Rambam's own poetic sense of the language that he uses to be accessible and apprehensible by people. I don't think, when I say that this is a book intended for everyone, what do I mean by everyone? I mean people who have some education, some use, some familiarity with the English language, some sensitivity to the poetry. There's nothing in the book that's unexplained. But if you're used to I find that some scholars, where they should have written an article, try to write a book. And they blow up the same idea over and over again by repetition. This is not that kind of a book. If a term is defined, if a point is explained, if an argument is spelled out, if background is given, it's going to be given, and there's lots of cross references and back references, and you can find it and figure it out. But if you're not taking it seriously, you're better off not reading it. It's not to be read casually. I stress, you really get the most out of the Guide to the Perplexed if you read it more than once, because then you'll see not only where it's going, but where it's been and why it's been there. And that's the kind of reader. Now, I'm finding there's another kind of reader I had in mind, and that is a scholar who's in a different field, maybe in Jewish studies, but not in philosophy. Maybe in philosophy, but not with much background. Doesn't necessarily know the difference between the Mishneh Torah and the Mishnah. You know, a person like that could read this book. A person like that has probably heard of Maimonides. Certainly the phrase, the Guide to the Perplexed, is on everyone's lips. It's even the name of a rib restaurant in Chicago. Very fine rib restaurant in Chicago, right? Kosher place. That's a familiar phrase, the Guide to the Perplexed. But people will pick up a paperback and they'll browse into it a little bit and they'll think they know something about it. And then if they're serious, they'll read some of the literature and they find the literature is full of controversies about whether Strauss was right, that Rambam didn't really believe what he was saying. And they'll be left very confused and leave it all behind. This book is for that kind of reader who wants to know what the guide is really all about, and this will open that up to him or her. This is something that you can get out of this book. You will not be more perplexed when you finish than when you started. I want to say one word about Perplexed, by the way, since I made a remark about Ibn Tibbon. I said a couple times that Ibn Tibbon's translation was a little disappointing to the Rambam. I want to say that his translation of the title was brilliant. Moreh Nevuchim. The word Nevuchim occurs only twice in the Tanakh. Once with the story of Esther, where the people have just learned of the genocidal decree of the Iranian emperor. Hayir Nebuchadnezzar, the people were in great consternation. That sounds like a memo, doesn't it? Like a bureaucratic memo. They were upset. They were worked up. They were really beside themselves. The other place where that word occurs is when the people are at the sea, escaping from Egypt, and Pharaoh is following with his chariotry, and he sees that he's got them trapped. They've got Pharaoh's chariots on one side and the sea behind them on the other. And the word Nebuchim is used there. That they were in a dilemma. They had nowhere to turn. And that's the idea that Ibn Tibbon picks up on when he uses that translation. The Arabic is very simple. The Arabic is said the guide for the confused. If you translated it literally, which I would do. What are they confused about? They're confused about the dilemma that they face between philosophy and science and logic on the one hand, and Torah and tradition and mitzvot on the other, and feeling like they have to choose between the two and they don't know how to choose. And the Rambam spells that out in his introductory discussion. That's a very interesting situation. And I really credit Ibn Tibbon as a great Hebraist for finding that rather unusual Hebrew word to convey the sense of dilemma that the original readers had, and that today's reader also, in a different way, also undergoes.
So I want to just a few comments about the translation. First of all, you in your one of your introductory, just to mention that you have a number of introductions here, introductory materials, you and Philip Lieberman. One is the object of the guide. One chapter is titled Maimonides' World. Another, the story of the guide. Another is translations, reception, and commentary. Another is this translation. Another is navigation before it. Now, yes. I do want to mention, you do discuss the translations there. There's also a volume, I think it's probably Chicago University Press, Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed in Translation. They have a whole volume about that's a different volume, not your book. You mentioned some other volumes. They talk about translations, but when we talk about translations, we also have to mention a few more. You didn't discuss Al-Akhrizi, another Rishon, early translation, and it has its issues, but you may as well mention it, as well as the more contemporary ones of Rabbi Yosef Kafich, Schwartz's translation, and there's the new Mifal Mishnah Torah 3-volume one as well.
Yes. Well, I have always thought very highly of Reb Kafich. He was a traditional Yemenite scholar, and among such people, rare in his acceptance among academics. He didn't come out of an academic background, but he came out of a background where he had manuscripts of some of these classic texts in the original, and I used Kafich's Arabic edition of Sajid Gaon's translation and commentary on the Book of Job, which I did in English for the Yale Judaica series. I had deep respect for him, and I think for those who are native readers of Hebrew, that would be a valuable thing. I corresponded with Schwartz when he was working on his. He was, again, a wonderful scholar. I think he died too young. But that's an option. Of course, our audience is for people who are more comfortable in English. Even if you read the Hebrew, even if you read the Arabic, you'll find that you can learn from what we've done, because we've got that elaborate commentary, which does try to take account of a great deal of the more recent literature, which has not been discussed in other versions. So if you're a serious full-time Rambam scholar and you've got a shelf of translations in your home and a whole bookcase full of commentaries and discussions and relevant literature, ours belongs in that bookcase. But if you're somebody who's a professor of law or philosophy or a history of ideas, this is the book to read, because if you read Pinus, you're not going to get the up-to-date, idiomatic English. Pinus was a great Arabist, and he knew a dozen languages, but English was not his native language. And when you're looking for the right word, I find, I was once, well, I won't tell you that story, but when you're looking for the right word, it really helps if you're a native speaker of English. And if you read, I tell my foreign students, if you want your English to be better, read English literature, read the great novels of the 19th century, read poetry. You've got to know the full range. English, like Arabic, like Hebrew, very rich language. And you want to be able to do with it all that it can do for you. I'm sure that there are flaws in this translation. I know that we have checked very carefully against any errors, and I haven't found any yet. There probably are some, but a book of that size. But it's this is the one to read if you want to really know what the Guide to the Perplexed is about. What does that perplexity consist in, and how is it addressed and resolved?
So we mentioned Pinus's name a bunch of times. Listeners may be familiar seeing it as Shlomo Pines. Maybe they're familiar with that. It's two volumes.
He always insisted. It was originally one volume, one very fat volume. He always insisted it was Pinus. He did it in class. I'm sorry about that. That's the way he pronounced it.
No, for sure. And I wanted to just tell listeners that have only seen it written and maybe not understand how it's pronounced. So it's 2 volumes. First of all, that's in paperback now, 2 volumes. It's like $30-something each. Yours is also the same larger size, but yours is hardcover, 1 volume, cheaper. Now, I also, obviously, different book. Also to mention,
this doesn't have the commentary. He has a big introduction by himself and a big introduction by Leo Strauss as well, and it doesn't have. There's something else I spent a fair amount of time on, Nafi. The indexes.
And just to jump in, I just want to finish just to mention the other. I'm going to get there, and just to mention, I was just absolutely. This is really, we're speaking about why an English reader would want to read an English edition. Just to mention the other Hebrew editions, there's really been such an explosion. As I mentioned, the 3-volume Mifal Mishnah Torah new translation, they have a small commentary in theirs. And then also recently, there's a new project that's hopefully will finish. They published last year the first volume of a kind of Mikros Gedolos, if you will, of Moreh Nevuchim. So it's the Ibn Tibbon translation, but with all the classic commentators around it, with some new from manuscript, with notes in the back. It's first of a planned 5 volumes. Hopefully they finish, because that was just published. That's the first volume of that came out recently. I can find the name exactly. It's a machon in Israel. They did an edition of Emunah Rama.
Where are they going to find?
Yeah, they did an edition of Emunah Rama of Ibn Daud, of Avram Ibn Daud, and they did one, and there was
a long time.
There was 2 new editions of that came out in Hebrew, but they did one, and then they did this. I can find the exact information. If anyone or interested in that volume, I could find the exact information.
Norbert Samuelson did the original Emunah Rama, but it was not widely distributed. There was his participation.
Yeah, so that's with the Moreh Nevuchim. And of course, by the way, if I haven't mentioned, there'll be links in the show's notes for anyone interested who can purchase Professor Goodman, your guide, and the companion volume. So let's talk about, you mentioned, I don't know if you have an example to read from the book, as well as we've talked about the notes and the commentary a bunch of times. What do you do in your commentary and your notes, if you want to explain, just kind of giving examples, but to give more specific?
Let me see if I can. I didn't.
I'll let you find. You can try to find an example that it could be any kind of example, just to give over kind of the flavor of what you're saying. That it's more trying to be readable, and especially in modern English, kind of what Schwartz, I guess, did for Ivrit, for Hebrew, kind of do a modern Hebrew as opposed to the old, and try to update it.
Okay, I'm looking.
And something else that I realized also we didn't discuss is, we actually did, but just to emphasize, is that your translation isn't a literal translation necessarily, word for word. It's not.
I don't believe in doing that. I'm translating for the sense, not for the words.
Yeah, just to drive that point home. You did mention that and talked about Ibn Tibbon, just to emphasize that.
Okay.
I mean, we can come back to it. Something else that you can discuss if you want is also what your companion volume does, and is that something? If you're obviously you want the potential buyer to buy both, but does someone have to buy both? Is that supposed to be an addendum? Is it an extra? What does it do compared to the main book?
You don't have to buy both. The companion volume gives the life of the Rambam. It gives what's wrong with Strauss, and it gives a rather full discussion of the 13 articles of belief, and it explains what their function was for the Rambam. And I can tell you about that now if you like, but I can't do that at the same time that I'm trying to find a nice passage to. I should have picked one out.
Go ahead, find a passage to share with the audience, and just that's fine. We'll get back to. I just wanted to at least get out there that you have this other a guide to the guide to the guide to the guide to the guide. Essentially, is what you kind of called the other volume. And what's really nice. Well, I'll talk a little while you look for it. What's really nice about the whole project in general is that how affordable it is. A lot of times, oftentimes, with academic books, they're not always affordable. Here, one hardcover book in a larger size is $50 list, and it's often less on Amazon. And then you have this paperback one that lists around $25. So altogether, you're not in it for all that much, as opposed to sometimes other translations. So you really did try to make it accessible for the masses. Besides for the readability factor, also the purchase price, the affordability is really there. You able to find anything?
I'm looking at the discussion of the problem of evil, since we talked about that, and I'm looking to see there's a place where he quotes Galen.
We also could do. I'm trying to think. What are the other famous parts of Martin Go ahead.
This is in part 3, chapter 12. I'll read you a little at the beginning of that chapter, and then I'm going to skip to the part where he quotes Galen. And Galen lived in the 2nd century. He was the physician of the emperor philosopher Marcus Aurelius. He was a very, very prolific author, and 126 of his books were translated from Greek into Arabic. Very, very celebrated physician, and a lot of his writings formed the basis of scientific medicine as it was practiced by not only by the Rambam, but by his predecessors and successors who worked in scientific medicine. Okay, this is the beginning of part 3, chapter 12. Now, the voice you hear is going to be Rambam's voice. I can't do it his way, but I'll do it in my voice. It often occurs to popular fancy that evils outstrip goods in the world. So the rhetoric and poetry of all nations bear this theme. The wonder is, they say, that time brings any good at all, ills being so rampant and unrelenting. This is not just a vulgar error. It is there even among those who claim to know something. Razi, another great physician of the 10th century, Razi wrote a famous book that he called Theology, filled with his ravings and colossal ignorance, making a case that there's more evil than good in the world. If you set the respite one enjoys while pleasures last against the pains and hurts, hardships and torments, chronic diseases and debilities, sorrows and disasters one suffers, you would find our existence, human life itself, is a bane, a dire evil visited upon us. He sets out to prove this with a litany of such woes, countering all that theists claim about God's manifest bounty and beneficence, and his being pure goodness, from whom, of course, only good flows. Now I'm going to skip to part where a little further on, he classifies different evils in the usual way. The evils we suffer because of our embodiment, the evils that we suffer because of what others do to us, and the evils that we suffer by our own doing. I'm going to read what he says about that first category. The ills one suffers through the nature of generation and corruption because one has a body. All our embodiment subjects some of us to maladies and disabilities, inborn or brought about by shifts among the elements, bad air, lightning, landslides. Divine wisdom, as I explained, determines that generation presupposes destruction. If individuals did not perish, our species would not endure. God's pure grace, goodness, and overflowing bounty are seen here. To wish one had flesh and bones, immune and impervious to all the ills that matter undergoes, is to wish unwittingly to unite opposites, to be both affected and unaffected. But what is unaffected does not develop, and it can never be more than one individual, not a species with multiple members. Galen says well in De Usu Partium, on the uses of the parts of the body, and he gives the chapter, part 3, chapter 10, quoting now from the Arabic version of Galen. Do not delude yourself with the vain hope that from semen and menstrual blood an animal could come that will not die or suffer pain, or that will move perpetually or shine like the sun. Close quote. Galen was stating a special case of the general truth that whatever arises in matter develops as fully as the matter of its species allows. The disabilities afflicting members of a species reflect the limitations of its matter. The most that can develop from blood and semen is man, with a nature that we know, alive, rational, and mortal. So ills of this first kind are inevitable in our species. Still, you find them very much the exception. Now, look at the commentary, since you asked for that as well. I give the reference to where Razi says those things. I give the reference to the parallel in Saja, who is the great predecessor of Rambam. Saja died in the 940s, so quite a bit earlier than Maimonides. There's a group of Muslim thinkers called the Sincere Brethren of Basra. They kept their identity secret because they were subversive. I translated their work, The Case of the Animals versus Man. And I quote here from that translation in the note where he's talking about people who give a great deal of emphasis to sufferings. And the wonder is that anything good can happen at all. Here's the way that note reads. Plato has Socrates say, quote, good things in life are few and evils many. That's in the Republic. Sadhya writes, any blessing we receive in this world here below is bound up with a corresponding injury. Every happiness with suffering, every pleasure with pain, every joy with sorrow. So I find that the counterparts are either equally balanced or the delight is outweighed by distress. Rambam doesn't like to criticize Sadhya by name, so he empties his quiver of arrows at Razi, but Sadhya said much the same thing, that evils outweigh goods in this life, and that was part of Sadhya's argument for why there has to be an afterlife to make up for the sufferings that are undeserved. A sense of alienation spurs, this is me now, a sense of alienation spurs the inference that a better world awaits us. Sadhya's image of a balance tilting toward distress echoes Razi's pessimism. You have a similar view in the Brethren of Purity of Basra. They're in the 10th century, and I quote at some length from their expression, and that'll be a good thing to stop with. The humans are boasting that humans are better than animals, and the animals refute them. The premise is that there's a law case brought by animals against human beings. They don't want to be mistreated, and human beings are better. And they say they have all these wonderful affairs and functions and parties, and the animals are saying, oh, that's all counterbalanced by the sufferings that you undergo. As for the gatherings you mentioned, the entertainments, parties, salons, and joyous levees, and happy celebrations, the weddings, feasts, and dances, your stories, your times to laugh, your receptions and testimonials, your glories and honors, adornments and embellishments, bracelets, bangles, anklets, and the like, which we animals have not. All the joy and gladness you derive from these are offset by all sorts of painful consequences, afflictions, and chastisements, from which we, our animals, are immune. The weddings give way to bereavements, the celebrations to wakes, the song and merriment to wailing and mourning, the laughter to tears, the joy and gladness to sorrow and grief. You leave your parties and your lofty, well-lit halls, perforce, for dark graves and narrow coffins. Your broad courtyards give way to dark dungeons and gloomy keeps. Your lively dancing done, you face whips and the scourge and the lash. Your bangles and bracelets turn to shackles, fetters, and chains. Your praises and honors now shame and humiliation and disgrace. An evil for every good, a torment for every pleasure. For every joy a heartbreak, care, calamity, or sorrow. So there you'll get a sense of it, both of how we translated the Rambam's passage, how he quotes Galen, how he relies on his differences from Sadja, and how Sadja is paralleled by his own contemporaries, slightly younger contemporaries, the Sincere Brethren of Basra, dramatizing that in their fable about the case of the animals versus man. That's a sampling. I think you'll see the level of language there. It's good English. It's not slang. It's not a cartoon book, anime, or something like that. But it's something that will be accessible to serious readers and of interest to anybody who cares about the Rambam or is curious about the Rambam and wants to know what he was up to in his Guide to the Perplexed.
Okay, and listen, like I said, I'll link in the show's notes. There's your guide to the guide as well, where you go into more. Just to read it, I guess for listeners, what's here? You have part 1, building blocks, where you talk about the Rambam, setting the scene, learning, Cairo, a new life, believing. Part 2, the work of the guide. You say defining the issues, problematics. And then part 3, esoterics, the esoteric style, not philosophy, ? Breadcrumbs. Then you have conclusion, the guide today. So there's a lot. Essentially, it's kind of, instead of like what they put Strauss and Pinus's huge introduction into the guide, you kind of separate it out as a separate volume.
Correct. When I talk about believing, that section of the Guide to the Guide is about the 13 articles of belief. And if we had more time, I would tell you, but I think we're getting near the end. But if you read that section, you'll see the answer to a question many people have asked: why did the Rambam incorporate his 13 articles of belief into Perplexed? That's an interesting question, and I think I have an answer to it. The answer that I offered for it is an original answer. The business about breadcrumbs is, if you know the story about the children who had to leave breadcrumbs so they could find their way back out of the woods, the breadcrumbs are Strauss's idea. The image is mine, but the language, the concept of Strauss's. He thinks that Rambam left hints in the form of intentional self-contradictions in order to convey to the reader that he didn't mean everything that he was saying. Most of what he was saying, he didn't really believe. I refute that pretty conclusively. There isn't time to go through that argument now, but people who read the book, I think, will find that convincing. So what I was talking about in Breadcrumbs is finding your way back out of the woods.
Which, of course, you're referring to Hansel and Gretel
Exactly.
when you say breadcrumbs. So, yeah, exactly. We already ran long. I know on the other episode, I listened to your episode on Judaism Demystified. I enjoyed that episode. It was over 2 hours. And I don't want to necessarily go that long. Obviously, I would say to the listeners, if you're still listening at this point and you enjoyed this podcast episode, you can email me. We can, Professor Goodman, I'm sure, will come back another time. We can go more into those things that we haven't gone through here. Here we were trying to focus on what the translation is, what it does, how it differs, the style of the translation. One thing to ask you as we wrap up is, what was it like translating? I know you've written a lot of other books, and you've done, like you said, Reb Sajagin and Iev and Job. You've done some other translation work, but what's that like? That process of translating, and here really it's translating and writing a commentary, and like you said, you're not translating literally, so you have to internalize and understand, of course, what's going on while you're translating. What's that process like?
That's a great question, and I can tell you, I started out working with Rabbi Professor Phil Lieberman. He's on leave now at Annapolis. He's a Navy chaplain as well as a rabbi and a professor, and he's working teaching at Annapolis in Maryland at the U.S. Naval Academy. We started out side by side. I had originally, I mentioned I started in 1970, so I didn't start working with Phil till many years later than that. But we worked on this for a number of years together, and we would sit side by side and we would discuss every word, every term. What's the right nuance? What's the right subtlety? What will avoid giving the wrong impression about what the Rambam means? And you can't rely just on dictionary definitions. You sometimes have to use very sophisticated dictionaries. You have to use other lexicons, and you have to be aware of the philosophical vocabulary that was used by Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Ibn Tufayl, the authors that Rambam read in Arabic philosophy and in Arabic versions of Greek philosophy. So that was a very lengthy and creative process. We surveyed the literature on Rambam systematically. And again, I apologize that we didn't cite every one of the thousands and thousands of articles that have been written about the Rambam since Venus translated it. But we got a good few hundred of them in there, and we learned a lot from that literature. And we had to make judgment calls about what to take seriously, what to disagree with, and in the last few years, Phil got engaged with other projects of his, and I wrapped it up myself and wrote the guide to the guide. But it was, I think the thing to leave with our listeners is that I learned from the guide every day that I worked on it. There was always something new. It's that rich. And I think if you read it seriously, you'll have the similar experience to what I had. It was philosophically very enlightening. Phil worked very hard on the reception of the guide and on the way other philosophers responded to this book, and on the background. In the guide to the guide, I also talk about the historical environment that Rambam lived in, the persecution by the Almohads, who were a particularly militant Islamic sect who conquered and ruled North Africa and Andalusia, which is southern Spain. It was great. One thing worth ending on. Rambam always calls himself is Hasfardi. He always calls himself an Andalusian. And that's for three reasons. I'll be talking about that a little bit on the Hamura podcast. He thinks that Andalusian halakha is more rational and more sensible and more in tune with the rabbinic intention and the biblical intention than the what had become by his time the rather stuck theology and rabbinic halakha treatment of the Gonim of they were living in Baghdad, but they were still called Babylonian, and he favors the Andalusian approach in halakha. That's brought out by Halbertal and others. He also believes, I mentioned earlier in our conversation, he believes that Andalusians have more background in science, in logic. He was trained in medicine in Andalusia and North Africa. He likes that naturalistic approach. He dislikes the kalam for trying to do away with nature. That was done in the service of the idea of creation, but it winds up making creation kind of empty, because then God creates things which he has to also manage and cause every event by his immediate act of will. He likes the idea of preserving nature. He likes the idea that the Andalusian thinkers rely on an idea of nature. He likes the idea that the Andalusians take argument seriously. That was when I mentioned Andalusia the first time, that a philosopher has to follow where the argument leads. That's what makes the Rambam a philosopher. Sometimes Some people have made it controversial whether Rambam was a philosopher. Faust did that, and so have others done. I think he shows himself to be a philosopher by his practice in the Guide to the Perplexed, but he also shows it very explicitly when he says a philosopher must follow where the argument leads. That's the trick. That's the achievement of the Guide, which is able to synthesize the use of reason with the use of our tradition, which is so rich and which he thinks is very responsive to the use of reason.
Okay. So with that, thank you. I think we ran pretty long. Professor Goodman, like I said, if anyone wants to hear more on the Rambam, obviously I should do more, but especially more on Moreh Nevuchim, more on the philosophical angle, please let me know. But that's it for this episode, and check out the show's notes where you can find links to purchase the new translation as well as the guide to the guide. And thank you, Professor Goodman, for joining me.
Great pleasure. I enjoyed our conversation, and I invite everyone to read and profit and enjoy. Take care.